Cold open. Miami General Hospital. Ward 7. 2:14 a.m. The dying man in bed 9 had a secret that could bring down an empire. He chose to give it to the only honest person in the building. The USB drive was the size of a thumbnail. It was taped to the inside of the dying man's left wrist with a strip of medical adhesive, hidden beneath the monitoring bracelet that beeped his failing heart rate to the nurse's station. Nurse Isabella Reyes found it when she was adjusting his 4-line at 2 in the morning, found it, recognized it for what it was, and stood very still for 11 seconds while her entire understanding of the night rearranged itself around her. The man in bed 9 was named Hugo Salcedo. He had been admitted 3 days ago with 2 gunshot wounds, one to the shoulder, one to the lower abdomen, and no identification. He had told the admitting team his name was Rafael Torres. He had told them he'd been robbed in the parking lot of a convenience store. Neither of these things was true. Isabella had known something was wrong from his first night. She had been a trauma nurse for 7 years. She knew the difference between a man who had been robbed and a man who was hiding. But she had said nothing because saying something was not her job. Her job was to keep him alive. She was failing at that too. The infection had spread faster than the antibiotics could manage. His fever had spiked to 104 degrees 2 hours ago. The attending had been paged 4 times. The honest prognosis, which no one had said aloud but everyone on the floor understood, was that Hugo Salcedo, or Rafael Torres or whoever he really was, would not see the morning. He had known it too. When Isabella leaned over to check his bracelet, his hand had closed around her wrist with a grip that shouldn't have existed in a body that compromised. His eyes had opened, bloodshot, yellow-tinged, terrified, and he had looked at her with the specific desperation of a man with something left undone. "Take it," he whispered in Spanish first, then English. "The drive. Take it. Don't let them have it. There's a man, Alejandro Cruz, he will come for it. He cannot have it. Please. You have a kind face. I've been watching for 3 days. You are the only one here who has a kind face." He died at 3:47 a.m. Isabella stood in the corridor outside bed 9 with a USB drive the size of a thumbnail in her breast pocket and the absolute certainty that she had just stepped off the edge of something she could not see the bottom of. She had 7 minutes to decide what to do before the day shift arrived. 7 minutes to decide whether to hand it to her supervisor, throw it in the medical waste bin, or walk out of the hospital with it and into whatever war the dying man had just drafted her into. She thought of her daughter, Camila, 8 years old, sleeping right now at her abuela's house 3 miles away, one stuffed elephant under each arm, completely safe and completely unaware that her mother's entire life was balanced on the edge of a decision being made in a hospital corridor at 3:48 in the morning. She thought of Hugo Salcedo's eyes. Kind face. I've been watching for 3 days. She thought of Alejandro Cruz, a name she had never heard, and understood instinctively, in the way that 7 years of reading human distress had trained her to understand, that whoever he was the reason Hugo Salcedo had 2 bullets in him. The drive went into her pocket. She walked to the nurse's locker room, changed out of her scrubs, and left the hospital through the staff exit into the warm Miami dark. She had no idea that the man in the black Mercedes parked across the street had been watching Ward 7's exit for 48 hours. She had no idea that the drive contained the complete financial records of the Cobra cartel. Every transaction, every bribe, every name, including the names of 14 law enforcement officials currently on the cartel's payroll. She had no idea that the man whose empire those records would destroy was, at that exact moment, 3 miles away, being told by his head of security that Hugo Salcedo was dead and the ledger was unaccounted for. She only knew that a dying man had trusted her with something he thought mattered. And Isabella Reyes had never in her life been able to put down something that mattered. 7 years earlier, Isabella Reyes had wanted to be a nurse since she was 6 years old, when her younger brother Mateo ran a fever of 105 and a young nurse named Patricia had stayed past the end of her shift to hold her mother's hand while Mateo screamed and convulsed and the doctors argued in the corridor. Patricia had not needed to stay. She had stayed because Isabella's mother was alone and afraid, and Patricia had seen it and responded to it the way some people respond to other people's pain, not as a professional obligation but as a human one. Isabella had decided then, that is what I will be. She had been 22 in 1 semester from finishing her nursing degree when she found out she was pregnant. The father, Marco, charming, unreliable, gone by the time she was showing, had left behind nothing but a name on a birth certificate and a talent for disappearing. Isabella's mother had wept. Her uncle had said nothing but stopped making eye contact for 3 months. Her program advisor had gently suggested she consider deferring. Isabella had not deferred. She had finished her degree with a newborn and a sleep deficit that she was still, 7 years later, not entirely certain she had recovered from. Camila was the finest thing she had ever done. She was also, on certain days, the most expensive. The childcare alone was a second rent. Her mother helped when she could, but her mother was 63 and her knees were going and she couldn't be relied on for the overnight shifts that Isabella sometimes couldn't avoid. Miami General was not a glamorous posting. Ward 7 handled the overflow, the people who arrived without insurance, without identification, without family. The people who fell through every other net. Isabella had been asked twice if she wanted to transfer to a better resourced floor. She had declined both times. She understood the people in Ward 7. She spoke their language, literally often since most of the staff didn't speak Spanish, and she understood the specific dignity required when a person had been stripped of everything else. Her supervisor, a compact and efficient woman named Dr. Okafor, called her the floor's conscience. She meant it as a compliment. Isabella accepted it as one. The night Hugo Salcedo arrived, Isabella had been 36 hours into a double shift. She had eaten a granola bar at 11 p.m. and half a vending machine sandwich at 2 a.m. Her feet were held together by force of habit and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had never yet let her body's complaints override her sense of duty. She noticed him immediately. The way his eyes moved when the orderlies came in. The way he positioned himself in the bed so the door was always in his sight line. The way he flinched, involuntarily, every time someone in scrubs he didn't recognize entered the ward. Not a robbery victim. A fugitive. But not her place to say. She kept his vitals. She managed his pain. She sat with him at 3 in the morning on his second night when the fever spiked and he was delirious in Spanish, saying things she didn't repeat to anyone. He had called her kind. She had simply been present. Now she was walking through a Miami parking lot at 4 in the morning with a USB drive in her breast pocket, and kindness had become something considerably more complicated. Alejandro Cruz was 44 years old and had not been photographed, willingly, in 11 years. He did not give interviews. He did not attend galas or charity dinners. His name appeared on no corporate filings, no property records in his own country, no donor lists. He was a man who had engineered his own invisibility with the same methodical patience he applied to everything, which was to say, completely. What Alejandro Cruz owned was harder to enumerate than what he did not. He owned politicians in 3 countries and law enforcement officials in 2 cities. He owned the Dock Workers Union in the Port of Miami. He owned, through 17 layers of shell companies for legitimate import businesses, a logistics firm and a small regional airline. And through all of these, moving as quietly as water through rock, moved the Cabra cartel's product. Cocaine from Colombia, fentanyl precursors from Mexico, methamphetamine through a distribution network that stretched from Miami to Atlanta to Chicago. He was also, though this was known to very few people, the father of a 14-year-old boy named Emilio who lived with his mother in Coral Gables and attended a private school where Alejandro paid the fees through a foundation account and attended the parent-teacher conferences under a name that wasn't his. Emilio did not know what his father did. Alejandro had spent 14 years ensuring that. He learned about Hugo's death at 4:15 a.m., when his head of security, a former military man named Sergeant, which was not his name but what everyone called him, called from the hospital parking lot to report that the target had expired and the drive was not on his person. The room Alejandro was in was very quiet when he heard that. The nursing staff, Alejandro said. We're running the floor roster now. Who had primary care of bed 9? Pause. The sound of a keyboard. A nurse named Isabella Reyes. She was on overnight. Left the building at 4:02 a.m. through the staff exit. Find her, Alejandro said. Quietly. He put the phone down and stood at the window of his Brickell penthouse and looked out at the Miami skyline and thought about what the drive contained. Not because he needed to remind himself he knew exactly, but because it helped to hold the full weight of the problem in his mind before he began solving it. The drive contained 11 years of records. Every transaction. Every name. Every bribe. Every arrangement. The work of Hugo Salcedo, who had been his accountant for a decade before his conscience had apparently reasserted itself with unfortunate timing. If that drive reached law enforcement, the right law enforcement, meaning the 14% who weren't already on his payroll, it would end everything. He had built this world so carefully. Brick by brick. Year by year. He had never been reckless, never been greedy, never been the kind of man who made headlines. He had believed, with the conviction of someone who had planned for every contingency, that he was untouchable. Hugo Salcedo had given a nurse a USB drive. The most dangerous object in the Western Hemisphere was currently in the breast pocket of a woman who had no idea what she was carrying. Isabella drove to her mother's house. She did not go home to her own apartment. Some instinct she couldn't fully articulate told her not to go somewhere she was expected to be, and she was too tired and too frightened to interrogate the instinct further than that. Her mother, Elena, opened the door at 4:30 a.m. in her housecoat with the expression of a woman who has spent a lifetime being woken by news she did not want. "I say, what happened?" "I'm fine. I just need to use your computer. Don't ask me anything yet." "How's Camila?" "Sleeping." "I say, please mama." "The computer." She sat at the small desk in the corner of her mother's living room, under the framed photo of the Virgin and the calendar from the Cuban restaurant 2 blocks away, and she plugged in the drive. She had told herself she would look for 10 seconds. Just long enough to understand what she was carrying. Then she would make a decision. She looked for 40 minutes. The drive contained 4 folders. The first was labeled simply Cabra, and it was the size of a textbook in digital form. Spreadsheets, transaction records, coded entries that resolved, once she understood the key, into payments and transfers and names. Names she recognized. Names she had seen on news programs. Names that made her sit back in her chair and press both hands flat on the desk to anchor herself to something solid. The second folder was labeled Insurance. It contained recordings, audio files, each one dated and tagged. She played 30 seconds of the first one and stopped it. A man's voice, recorded without his knowledge, discussing a transaction that would have ended his career and his freedom if anyone in the right position ever heard it. The third folder was labeled Emilio. She almost didn't open it. It contained a single document, a letter, handwritten and photographed, dated 8 months ago. She read it twice. It was a letter from Hugo Salcedo to Alejandro Cruz. It was not a threat. It was a plea. It laid out, in careful and emotionally precise language, Hugo's belief that the money they were moving was killing people. That the operation had crossed a line that Hugo could not step back over. That there was a boy named Emilio who deserved a father he could be proud of. That there was still time. Cruz had apparently not agreed. The fourth folder was labeled for whoever finds this. Inside was a single document, a memo from Hugo, addressed to no one, explaining everything. The drive's existence. Its contents. What it proved. And at the bottom, a single instruction. Give this to Special Agent Dana Whitfield, FBI, Miami Field Office. She is not on the list. She is the only one I know who is not on the list. Isabella sat in her mother's living room for a long time after she closed the last file. Camila coughed in the next room. The small, unremarkable cough of a sleeping child. She thought of Hugo's eyes. Kind face. You are the only one here who has a kind face. She thought of the letter to Emilio's father. It was not a threat. It was a plea. She thought of the 14 names on the list, 14 law enforcement officials who had been paid to be blind, and understood that this was not simply dangerous. This was the kind of dangerous that had weight and shape and reach. The kind of dangerous that could find her at her mother's house, at Camila's school, at the hospital. She unplugged the drive. Put it back in her pocket. Then she looked up Special Agent Dana Whitfield. She found the black Mercedes at 7 in the morning. She had left her mother's house at 6, kissed a still sleeping Camila on the forehead, promised her mother nothing specific, and driven back toward her apartment to change before she could think too hard about what she was planning to do. The Mercedes was parked across from her building. She would not have noticed it. It was a common enough car in this part of Miami, except that it was in a tow-away zone and had been there, she realized, since she had left for work the previous afternoon. The same car. The same position. The windows were tinted. Isabella drove past without slowing. She circled the block. The car did not move. She drove to a Walgreens 4 blocks away and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes, breathing carefully, thinking about everything Hugo had said and everything the drive contained and the specific geometry of a situation that had just become undeniable. They had already found her. She did not go back to her apartment. She called Dana Whitfield's office from a number she found on the FBI's public website. A recorded message told her that the office opened at 8:30. She left her name and the word urgent and the phrase Hugo Salcedo and her callback number, and then she sat in the Walgreens parking lot and waited. Her phone rang at 8:07 a.m. "This is Whitfield." The voice was clipped, careful, awake in the way of someone who had been awake for hours. "My name is Isabella Reyes. I'm a nurse at Miami General. A man died in my care last night. His name was Hugo Salcedo, though he checked in as Rafael Torres. Before he died he gave me something and told me to bring it to you. He said you were the only one who wasn't on the list. A silence. 3 seconds. 4. Where are you right now? A Walgreens on Flagler. There's a car outside my building. Black Mercedes, tinted windows. I think they already know. Another silence. Shorter this time. Do not go home. Do not go to anyone you know. Write down this address. Dana Whitfield was 41 and had spent the last 3 years building a case that kept collapsing. The Cobra Cartel was not the largest operation in South Florida. It was the most careful. Most operations left debris, informants, rivals, loose ends, the inevitable human tendency toward carelessness. Alejandro Cruz left nothing. Every lead Dana had ever developed had either disappeared, recanted, or turned up in a condition that discouraged further cooperation. She had begun to believe, not professionally but privately, that she was dealing with something she could not crack from the outside. That the only way in was from the inside. Hugo Salcedo had been her best hope for 2 years. She had known he existed, had known the cartel's financial architecture was too clean to be maintained without someone exceptional, but had never been able to identify him. He had been a ghost with a ledger. Now he was simply a ghost. But he had apparently left the ledger behind. She met Isabella at a diner in Little Havana, a corner booth, backs to the wall, facing the door. She was there 15 minutes before the arranged time, and she watched Isabella Reyes walk in through the glass and assessed her in the way 7 years of field work had trained her to assess people. Quickly, dispassionately, and in total. Scrubs still on under a jacket. No makeup. Hands that were steady but eyes that were doing the calculus of danger. A woman who had not slept and knew it and had decided that sleep was a lower priority than the thing she was carrying. She sat down across from Isabella and said, "Show me." Isabella put the drive on the table. Dana looked at it for a moment. Then at Isabella. "Did you open it?" "Yes." "What did you see?" Isabella told her. Systematically, in the organized way of someone who had learned to manage information under pressure. The folders. The names. The recordings. The letter. The instruction. Dana listened without interrupting. When Isabella finished, Dana sat back in her chair and looked at the window and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Do you understand what you're carrying?" "I understand enough." "The 14 names on that list," Dana said. 3 of them are federal. 1 of them is in my building. If the wrong person finds out this drive exists before I can get it to the right people, it disappears. Along with anything connected to it. She let that settle. "Along with you," she added. "I know," Isabella said. "You have a daughter." It was not a question. Dana had looked up Isabella Reyes in the 40 minutes between the phone call and this meeting. "Yes." "Then you understand why I need to ask you the next question carefully." "Ask it." "Why didn't you throw this in a drain? Or hand it to your supervisor and walk away? You have no obligation here. Hugo Salcedo was a patient, not your responsibility. You could have spent this morning in bed and had no part in any of this." Isabella looked at her hands on the table. "He trusted me," she said. "He was dying and he looked at me and he decided I was the person to give this to. I'm not in the habit of deciding that someone else's trust was misplaced." Dana studied her. "I need 48 hours to get this to people I can verify are clean. In those 48 hours you cannot go home. You cannot contact anyone who might be monitored. You cannot tell anyone, including your mother, including colleagues at the hospital, what you have or where you are. My daughter. I'll arrange protection for her and your mother. Right now. Before we leave this table." Pause. "Will it work?" Isabella asked. "Not hopefully. Just directly. The drive. Will it actually bring him down?" Dana looked at the USB drive on the table between them. "If this contains what you're describing," she said, "Alejandro Cruz will spend the rest of his life in a federal facility. And 14 other people will go with him." Isabella reached across the table and pushed the drive toward her. "Then let's not waste time. Sergeant called at noon. We have a name. Isabella Reyes. Trauma nurse, Ward 7. Single mother, 1 daughter named Camila, 8 years old. Lives at—" "I know where she lives," Alejandro said. "Does she still have the drive?" "We believe so. She didn't go home. Her car was spotted at a diner in Little Havana at approximately 8:15. She met a woman there." Pause. "We ran the plates on the other woman's vehicle," Sergeant said, and his voice had changed. "Boss. The other woman is FBI." Alejandro was quiet for a moment. He was in the kitchen of his Brickell penthouse, making coffee. A small, domestic action that he continued performing even as the conversation recalibrated everything. "Name. Dana Whitfield." She's been building a case against us for 3 years. She's clean, she's not on the list. Alejandro set down the coffee cup carefully. He thought about the timing. The drive had been out of his control for less than 8 hours. In those 8 hours, a trauma nurse with no connection to his world had already found the one federal agent Hugo had identified as trustworthy and passed the drive to her. The operation was fast. Either Isabella Reyes was considerably more resourceful than her file suggested, or Hugo's instructions had been very clear. He suspected both. Where is Whitfield now? Unknown. She left the diner. We lost the car in traffic. And the nurse? Unknown. She was not in Whitfield's vehicle. Separate departure. Alejandro thought. 48 hours. That was the standard window for something like this. Enough time to verify the material and move it to secure hands. He had less than 2 days before this became irreversible. There were things he could do in 2 days. He had done more in less. But he had never done them with a nurse and an FBI agent working in parallel, when he didn't know where either one of them was. Find her, he said. The nurse. Whitfield will have protocols, safe houses, secured communications. The nurse is a civilian. She will want to see her daughter. Watch the school. Watch the grandmother's address. She will surface. And when she does? Alejandro looked out at the bay, at the water bright and flat under the noon sun. Bring her to me, he said. Gently. I want to speak with her. He put the phone down. He thought about the letter Hugo had written. The one Sergeant had told him about years ago, before Hugo had become a problem. He thought about what Hugo had said in that letter, about Emilio. About time. He thought about a nurse who had taken a dying man's trust seriously enough to drive across Miami at 4 a.m. He thought, what kind of person does that? Dana put Isabella in a safe house in Hialeah, a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner, registered to a name that didn't exist, stocked with 48 hours of groceries and a prepaid phone. She put 2 plainclothes agents on Camila's school and 2 more on Elena Reyes's house. She told neither of them why. Isabella sat in the Hialeah apartment and watched the ceiling and did not sleep. She thought about Camila. She thought about Hugo's eyes. She thought about the letter, a man who had built his life in service of something terrible, writing to the father of a boy who didn't know, trying to find the door back to the human being he might once have been. She thought about Dana's question. Why didn't you throw this in a drain? She hadn't had a good answer in the diner. She still didn't. The honest answer was the one that made the least strategic sense, because it mattered and she had never been able to ignore something that mattered. Her brother Mateo had died at 9 years old, 6 years after the fever that hadn't. A different sickness. A slower one. She had been 14, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to still believe that understanding could change outcomes. Patricia, the nurse, had been there. Not because it was her shift, just because she had come. She had held Elena's hand through the night. She had been present in the way that some people know how to be present. Not fixing, not managing, just there. Isabella had become a nurse to be Patricia. She had not become a nurse to carry cartel ledgers through Miami in the early morning. But here she was. The phone Dana had left rang at 11 p.m. on the first night. It's me, Dana said. We've been hit. Isabella sat up. What does that mean? Someone accessed our property records database. They're looking for any address connected to my name or my unit. The safe house you're in is 3 layers removed, they won't find it tonight. But tomorrow is less certain. The drive. The drive is in a secured facility that isn't connected to my unit. It's safe. But Isabella, I need you to understand something. The person I needed to deliver this to is unreachable until tomorrow morning. There's a window of about 6 hours where the drive is secured but the case hasn't been officially opened. In that window, if they find you and use you as leverage, things become complicated. Pause. Complicated how? I would have to make choices, Dana said. I don't want to have to make those choices. Isabella understood. What do I do? Stay there. Don't use the phone except to call this number. Don't open the door. I will come personally at 6 a.m. and take you to a location where you will be safe until this is over. Dana. My daughter. Is safe. I have people on her. I give you my word. The line went quiet. Isabella sat in the dark apartment above the dry cleaner and listened to the sounds of Hialeah settling into the night, and she thought about the 6-hour window, and she thought about leverage, and she thought about a man she had never met whose name was Alejandro Cruz, and she understood with perfect clarity that the morning was going to be one of the harder things she had ever had to get through. She was right. At 3 a.m. someone knocked on the door. She did not open it. She stood on the other side of the door with her back against the wall and the prepaid phone in her hand and said nothing, Because saying nothing was the only correct response to a knock at 3 in the morning at an address no one was supposed to know. "Ms. Reyes," said the voice on the other side. Male, even accented in the specific way of someone who learned formal English carefully. "My name is Alejandro Cruz. I am alone. I have no weapon. I would like to speak with you." Isabella stared at the door. "I understand why you wouldn't believe that," the voice continued. "I understand why the correct thing to do is to call Agent Whitfield right now. I'm asking you not to, for 6 minutes. Give me 6 minutes to say what I came to say. After that, the decision is entirely yours." A silence. "I know about your daughter," he said. "I want to be clear, that is not a threat. It is the opposite. My people know where she is. I have called them off. What happens to Camila is not contingent on this conversation. She is safe regardless of what you decide tonight. I am telling you this because you deserve to hear it, not because I am using it." Isabella stood very still. 7 years of reading patients at their most frightened and most vulnerable had given her an instrument she trusted more than most evidence. She pressed it to the voice on the other side of the door. She heard fear. Carefully managed but present. She opened the door on the chain. He was exactly as unglamorous as his reputation suggested. He was invisible. Medium height. A face that would not be remembered in a lineup. He was wearing a plain shirt and dark trousers, and he was, as far as she could see, alone in the corridor. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were the tell. They were the eyes of a man who was running out of something. Not time, specifically, though that too, but something less quantifiable. Something she saw occasionally in patients who had received news they hadn't yet accepted. 6 minutes, Isabella said. "Thank you." She did not let him in. She stood in the doorway with the chain still on and looked at him. "Hugo was my accountant for 10 years, he said. "I trusted him with everything. He was the most careful man I had ever met. He began having doubts approximately 2 years ago. I was aware of this. I chose to believe he would manage them." "He managed them by dying," Isabella said. Something crossed Cruz's face. "Yes," he said simply. "Why are you here? The drive is not in this room." "I know that. I am not here for the drive." Isabella waited. "I have a son," Alejandro Cruz said. 14 years old. He doesn't know what I do. I have spent 14 years making certain he doesn't know. In the morning, when your agent delivers that drive to whoever she is delivering it to, he will find out. Not immediately, but eventually. His name will be connected to mine. His life will be connected to mine." He was quiet for a moment. "Hugo wrote me a letter. You read it? He said there was still time. You didn't believe him." "I didn't want to believe him," Cruz said. "There is a difference." The corridor was very still. "What is it you want from me?" Isabella asked. "Nothing," he said. "I want nothing from you. I came to tell you that whatever happens next, whatever the drive causes, your daughter will not be touched. Not by me, not by anyone connected to me. I am making that commitment to you directly because you deserve to hear it from me directly. You could be saying that to make me hesitate. To buy yourself time." "Yes," he said. "I could be. You'll have to judge that for yourself." A long silence. "Hugo trusted you," he said. "He said so in his instructions. He watched you for 3 days and he decided you were the person. I wanted to understand why." "And?" "I think I understand," Cruz said. "You have the kind of face that makes people believe the world still contains something worth trying for." He stepped back from the door. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Reyes. I'm sorry you were put in the middle of this." He walked to the end of the corridor and through the stairwell door. Isabella stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she closed the door, sat down on the floor against the wall, and did not sleep for the rest of the night. Dana arrived at 6:03 a.m. She looked at Isabella's face and said, "Something happened." Isabella told her. Dana sat down on the edge of the couch and listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Isabella finished she was quiet for a moment that had a particular quality, the quality of someone revising an internal map. "He came here himself," Dana said. "Yes. That's not how he operates. In 11 years, Alejandro Cruz has never personally appeared in connection with a problem. He has always been 3 layers back." "I know," Isabella said. "I looked him up." "Why do you think he came?" Isabella thought about it. "Hugo's letter," she said. "I think he read it 11 months ago and put it aside and kept telling himself there was time to think about it. And then Hugo died and the drive appeared and suddenly there wasn't any more time. I think he came here because he needed to look at the person who had been trusted with his reckoning and understand whether she was worth reckoning with." Dana looked at her for a moment. That's either the most generous interpretation possible, she said, or you have a remarkable instinct for people. I'm a nurse, Isabella said. It's the same thing. The drive was formally entered into evidence at 9:47 a.m. The supervising agent who accepted it, a man Dana had been building trust with for 2 years, one of the 3 federal agents in the Miami field office whose name did not appear on Hugo's list, looked at the contents for 20 minutes and then made 11 phone calls in the following order. His supervisor, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the director of the FBI's Miami division, and 8 people whose titles and roles Isabella was never told. By noon, things had begun to move. Alejandro Cruz did not run. This surprised nearly everyone involved in the operation, including Dana, who had spent enough time studying him to have developed theories about how he would respond to the walls closing in. The theories had all involved movement, disappearance, the activation of contingencies she had spent 2 years cataloging. Instead, he was at his son's school at 3:15 p.m. when the federal agents arrived. He was standing by the fence in the afternoon light, watching Emilio's soccer practice through the chain link when they came. He did not reach for anything. He did not attempt to run. He put his hands up with the specific economy of a man who had been expecting this and had decided, at some point between 3 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, to stop fighting it. The agent who made the arrest would later say that Cruz had looked, when the cuffs went on, almost relieved. Emilio saw it happen. There was no way to prevent that. But the story that Emilio Cruz carried into his adulthood, the story he eventually told years later in ways that mattered, was not the story of a man who ran. It was the story of a man who, at the very end, stood still and let the consequences arrive. It was not redemption. It was not enough. But it was something. The 14 names on Hugo's list were arrested or placed under investigation within 72 hours of the drive entering evidence. 3 federal agents. 4 Miami-Dade officers. A state prosecutor. 2 city council members. A port authority director. 2 customs officials. The Cobra Cartel's operation did not survive the week. Without Cruz at its center and with the financial architecture fully exposed, it fragmented almost immediately, the natural result of an organization built around one man's careful invisibility. Dana told Isabella all of this in a conference room at the federal building on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the night in Ward 7. Isabella listened to the numbers and the names and the scope of it and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride, exactly, and not satisfaction, because those words implied that she had set out to accomplish something. She hadn't set out to accomplish anything. She had simply responded to what was in front of her. 14 names, she said. One of them was in your building. He was arrested Tuesday, Dana said. He had been routing information to Cruz's network for 6 years. Did he know about the drive? He knew it existed. He didn't know you had it. He assumed Cruz had retrieved it before I was ever contacted. Isabella thought about the 7 minutes in the corridor outside bed 9. About the specific texture of that silence. About the weight of a thumb drive in the breast pocket of a set of scrubs. What happens to Cruz's son? Dana paused. His mother has family in Charlotte. She's relocating. The boy he'll carry it. But he'll be okay. The letter, Isabella said. Hugo's letter in the drive. Does it get used? In the prosecution? It's part of the record. Yes. Pause. He was trying to be honest, Isabella said. Not defending him. Just stating it. Hugo. Both of them. Toward the end. Dana looked at her. You're a complicated person to have in a crisis, she said. I'm a nurse, Isabella said. I see the whole patient. 3 weeks after the arrest, a package arrived at Miami General Hospital addressed to Isabella Reyes, trauma nurse, Ward 7. Inside was a stuffed rabbit, slightly worn, with one ear that was shorter than the other where someone had repaired it carefully with matching thread. There was a note, handwritten on plain paper, from Emilio Cruz. He had found her name in the news coverage of the case, coverage that had been, against Dana's best efforts, somewhat unavoidable, since a trauma nurse returning a dying man's dying wish was the kind of story that attached itself to a news cycle and didn't let go. The note said, My dad told my mom that the night everything fell apart, he met a woman who reminded him that some things were worth trying for. He said she had a kind face. My mom thought I should find her and say thank you, even though thank you is weird when you're thanking someone for putting your father in prison. But she said it was the right thing to do. So, thank you. I think my dad made a lot of wrong choices. But maybe at the end he made one right one. I don't know. I'm still figuring out what I think. Emilio. Isabella read it twice. She folded it carefully. She put it in her locker, where she still had a small photo of Matteo and a drawing Camila had made of the two of them at the beach. She went back to Ward 7. Bed 9 had a new patient, an elderly man named Mr. Ferreira who had arrived without identification and spoke only Portuguese and had the same careful, watching eyes she had noticed in Hugo. Not a fugitive this time. Just a man a long way from home. She adjusted his foreline. She smiled at him. She said, in the limited Portuguese she had been learning since Tuesday, "You are safe here. My name is Isabella. I will take care of you." He relaxed. The specific relaxation of a person who has been waiting to be told exactly that. Isabella Reyes picked up his chart and went to work. Some things didn't change no matter what else did. A person in front of you needing help. The choice of whether to give it. She had always known what she would choose. Epilogue: What holds? 14 months later. Camila was 9 and had recently become very serious about marine biology, which meant the apartment was full of library books about dolphins and an ongoing argument about whether they could get a fish tank. Isabella's position was that she cleaned enough things professionally without adding an aquarium to her personal responsibilities. Camila's position was that the dolphin book was very persuasive and Isabella hadn't read it yet. The trial had concluded 6 weeks ago. 41 counts. Cruz had entered a guilty plea in the end. Dana had told Isabella this on the phone on a Tuesday, her voice carrying something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. The plea had spared Emilio the worst of a public trial. It had also, his attorney had argued, reflected a measure of cooperation that the court took into account in sentencing. 22 years. Not nothing. Not everything. Isabella had been asked to testify and had done so in 6 hours across 2 days. Direct, accurate, specific. She had answered every question she was asked and nothing more. She had not editorialized. She had not performed anything. Afterward, Dana had met her in the courthouse corridor and said, "You were remarkable in there." Isabella had said, "I told the truth. That's not remarkable." Dana had looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression people wore when they wanted to argue with her but couldn't find a flaw in the logic. Dana Whitfield was now the supervising agent for the FBI's Miami Organized Crime Division. The promotion had followed the case with the swift inevitability of a thing long delayed but always coming. She and Isabella had dinner every 3 weeks or so, Cuban food in Little Havana, the same diner where they had first met, and talked about the cases Dana couldn't discuss in specifics but could discuss in general, and about Camila's marine biology phase, and about the various ways the world remained frustratingly imperfect and what it was possible to do about that. It was a friendship that should not, by any external logic, have existed. An FBI agent and a trauma nurse who had met over a dead man's USB drive at 8 in the morning. But it had become one of the more important friendships of Isabella's life, and she had stopped being surprised by the ways things found their shape. She was on the night shift when the thought struck her, standing in the corridor of Ward 7, checking the board, drinking the coffee that was always worse at 2 a.m. than it had any right to be. A year ago, she had stood in this same corridor with a dead man's drive in her pocket and 7 minutes to make a decision. She had made the decision that Patricia would have made. The decision that the 14-year-old girl who had watched her brother die and decided what kind of person she wanted to be would have made. Not because it was safe. Not because she knew what would follow. Because something had been placed in her hands by a man with nowhere else to turn, and she was not the kind of person who put things like that down. She was not sure she had always known that about herself. She suspected she had always known it and had simply never been tested at exactly the right angle before. The corridor was quiet. The ward hummed its soft nocturnal hum. Somewhere, a monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere else, a patient coughed and settled. Isabella finished her coffee, put the cup in the bin, and went back to work. This was what she was. This was what she had always been. The woman with the kind face. It was, she had learned more than enough. Every institution is held together by the people who refuse to look away. They are not always the most powerful people in the room. They are usually the ones no one thinks to watch. They are usually the ones who decide everything.